Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I fence out of MarylandKDF, and today I want to talk a little bit about a different way of teaching Montante than most of the ways I've seen it taught previously. In my experience, and as well as it seems the experience of most individuals that I've talked to, we teach Montante based off of reglets. And that makes sense, given that that's how all the literature for them is written. However, it seems odd to me that we teach all other sword forms based on fundamentals, biomechanics, how to do various types of attack, and all these things before we ever get into combinations or anything like that. We don't tend to have a tendency to teach longsword based entirely on techniques described. Rather, we have a tendency to build up first the different types of strikes, the mechanics for strikes, and things like that. I also teach some military saber, and it seems that the fundamentals always come first as well. So I've talked to a lot of people about this recently, and I felt that a Montante curriculum based off of biomechanics, basic understandings of how to wield a larger weapon with a different hilt to blade ratio than what we're used to from a longsword would be a good place to start. So I'm going to be doing a series on this that is based off of a class I'm teaching, so I'll be writing the series as I go along. This first class has the purpose of getting you used to wielding something this size. I'm also going to say now that not a lot of this is super original. It's just now being put into a different framework. My original instructor was James Clark. If you've worked with him before, you'll recognize a lot of what I'm saying as things that you may have been taught by him. And I will refer back to some of his videos along the way, as well as other people's. In lesson 3, we'll be using Guy Windsor's Iron Butterfly, for example. So longsword and Montante, which are longsword is where a lot of people start. Montante is very different, and I think the primary difference is, outside of the obvious, that it's more rules based than fencing based. There's just a difference in the way we wield the sword. The way I like to describe that to my students is that with Montante, you're not always forcing the sword to do things. With longsword, you're very much directing everything. But in Montante, you kind of have to let the sword do its own thing sometimes. This is just based on the size and the fact that you need the momentum to move, and sometimes you just have to let the sword do that work for you. So what we're going to start working on today is basically moving the sword around a little bit with what are essentially low or chest height middle house. And the primary thing we're going to focus on is learning to generate the power and getting comfortable generating the power from the core rather than from the shoulders or even from footwork. So the first exercise I want people comfortable doing is just holding the sword and allowing the core to do the work. So you take a stance a little bit, shoulder width or a little bit wider apart, grasp the sword in what is basically a hammer grip. I know I've had the discussion about hammer versus handshake versus thumb grip for Montantes, and for what we're going to do now, we're going to stick to the hammer grip just because I think for my purposes of figuring this out, I think it's the easiest. So loose stance, shoulder width apart with the feet, arms comfortably down. When I say extend arms later on, I'm also not meaning to push the elbows through, but just comfortably extended. We want to just wind up with the core and then swing the core through. Then reset and swing the core through. Now, don't have to do this changing your position of your head. You can stay relatively square, but I find tracking a little bit helps. The primary thing a lot of people run into here is wanting to swing the sword with the arms while doing this movement. The point really is to do it from the core. So, nice and leisurely with the arms. We're not actually cutting or striking here, we're just getting comfortable. Now, if you're like me and you have an inflexible knee due to injury or whatever, it's always fine, I think, to come up onto the toe a little bit in the direction you're swinging from. You see me turning my knees there. You'll also find that if you do this, there comes a point where your sword kind of stops. You can't really go much further unless you start to use your arms. And find where that is for you. We'll get there in a minute. So, just leisurely swinging back and forth. You'll notice my arms really aren't doing much other than keeping the sword in my hands. Now, obviously we can do this from both sides, long edge on both sides, so if you cross your arms on your left, swing through, you'll notice that this one goes further around yourself just because you can break that back out into open arms, but try to keep the crossed arms and see where that becomes uncomfortable. And as you do this, you're really just doing it from the core. There's no arm power involved. Now, once you feel comfortable with that, we want to be able to go back and forth with the long edge. This requires us to do is invert the sword. We'll do the inversion of the sword simply by folding it over to keep the short edge traveling in the direction we started. So we're swinging right to left, and then we swing over and the other way as well. Now, but a lot of people say on previous videos that I've done that I should worry about my edge alignment. We're not worrying about edge alignment. Edge alignment comes with practice. Edge alignment comes when these things are comfortable and we can make small adjustments. I'm also not too worried about how long my arc is in one direction before I switch. That's really not the point here. You'll find a point where it becomes somewhat uncomfortable with extended arms, and at that point you switch. This should be eventually almost 180 degrees of arc with the long edge. And again, use your legs to be comfortable, but not to generate power. The same is true of your arms. Now, if you find that you are using your arms to swing and just not letting your body do the work, my suggestion is following the blade with your eyes and really indexing your eyes to the sword. That should limit how fast you move just so you don't get whiplash. The other thing is to maintain relatively straight arms. And how your upper arm meets your side should also help index that swing to body motion. Also, don't try to stop this abruptly. Let it wrap around and let it bring time. You're essentially setting yourself up like a coiled spring. You really just with your core move the sword around. It's not about power, it's not about speed, it's just about feeling comfortable with an enormous sword in your hand. This is a big sword even for Montante. It's 5'8", 7.5 pounds, with a 17.5-inch hilt. So this is big even for Montante. The Purple Heart or the Black Fencer synthetics are perfectly fine for this. So we've swung back and forth on the bottom, and if you've done Godinho, for example, as one of the texts, you'll recognize that this is essentially where he has you cut whenever there's a shields person involved. Right, so this is a cut from the manuals. It's just a good place to get comfortable because we don't have to engage our shoulders that much. Now, the next step is switching, so you're essentially cutting from the same side twice. We do this for the transition over the head. Now, it's important to note that for this specific transition, What I'm giving you as the transition is a square transition. This is not a full circulating stripe across around the whole body like this, because that requires a lot more control to do safely. This is a square transition. Cut to one side, a motion around the top of our head, but with straight arms, essentially ducking through our arms. We bring it across. This will uncross the arms. So we cut, we invert into a cross, and we come across ourselves square. Ideally, and I'll turn sideways for this, you want to keep your arms relatively straight in this process. Transition, straight arms over. Now, the reason we do this with straight arms, particularly the right one extended, is to prevent the tip dropping and us hitting ourselves in the head with the cross guard. Once more, cut, invert, square across. Okay. And now focus on keeping the body upright at the same time. With a relatively comfortable way, cutting from both sides. Now, as always when starting something new, and even more so when starting something new with montante, it is important to do this slowly. Perhaps uncomfortably slowly, as it is a heavy sword. The reality is with montante, momentum matters and momentum makes things easier. However, momentum only makes things easier if you can do it more than once without hitting yourself in the head. So always take it nice and slow. Always work out the technique, the places your arms and legs and the sword are moving. Make sure that what you're doing is safe, and eventually speed comes. As one of our club mottos, we say slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And there's a lot of accuracy to that. So set yourself up squarely, find your comfortable position on the side, swing from right to left, invert, come over the head, do it again. Try not to bend your right arm the way I just did. Okay. This is not necessarily the most energetically efficient way of doing this. I find sometimes that the sort of very wide rotational stuff is quite energetically efficient, but it builds up to other places. I use this transition in my Godinho 3. I've modified Guy Windsor's Iron Butterfly to build this in, and generally I find it a very, very useful way to switch directions in other montante flows. So if we can do it from right to left, we can do it from left to right. Start crossed arms, long edge, find that inflection point, and then bring it up and over our head. Again, trying to maintain good structure all the way through. Again, this is not about throwing the tip behind ourselves and rolling it around, but rather to bring it across, transition, and squarely bring it through. Ideally, you won't use your upper body too much outside of just, and once you speed this up, a lot of that energy comes from the momentum, which is what we want. But again, start slow, drill this a lot, get comfortable with it, and then work in switching to something a little bit more speedy. The next thing as part of this is to switch sides as you move and start your first sort of montante flow. What I have my students do is 2 cuts from each side with a transition in between. So there's 1 cut from right to left, invert, transition over, another cut, invert, don't transition, switch, left to right, cut, bring it over your head, cut again, invert. This allows you to now build up a bit of a flow that feels kind of like an early regla. I'm far more comfortable teaching a flow early on that isn't a regla other than maybe like Figueroa 1, Alfieri 7, the basics, which I build into the series that I'm working on now, because we're not trying to teach them new tricks at the same time as teaching them basics. Flows have a tendency to confuse people. They tend to get focused on the progression of the rules rather than learning the basic biomechanics. Now, I know a lot of people who teach something like Barbaron, which is much more simplistic, much fewer rules to begin with, and then teach biomechanics alongside that. That's a really valid approach. It's very useful. But I wanted to see if we can't get people to start on basics. So eventually your flow, to start off with, would look like this. One cut, transition, second cut, transition, with no transition, sorry, one cut. Let me start that again. Cut, invert, transition, cut, invert, cut, invert, transition, cut, invert. And then you can start stringing those together as much as you have the strength for. Now, the important thing to remember early on is that each section of that flow has parts. We have the cut, which has to come from the core. Keep that in mind while maintaining long extended arms. We have the inversion, which really should just come at the point of discomfort on either side. It'll reach a point where it's a little weird, and then just invert it. That shouldn't take much in the way of energy, and is often done with the backhand. If you look, do it, I'm going to just push the backhand. Pull the backhand out. Push the backhand through. Pull the backhand out. Okay, and you'll see I'm doing that with an open hand on purpose. The amount of power required is just me pushing my thumb joint through on the pommel. So it's not something that requires power or speed. With the cut, we have the inversion, we have the transition. So if early on you do this segmentedly, and really think about it, cut, transition, over the head. Cut, inversion, not over. Cut, inversion, over. Cut. The smoothness will come as each of those individual parts become clearer and more comfortable. If any of you are musically inclined, if you're learning arpeggios or long things, you go one part and the next part, and then do the second and third part together, and then the third and fourth part together. And you can do the same thing with your entendre stuff. So we can take the cut and the inversion and make them one. We'll do it again. Cut, inversion is one. Then we can do the cut, and then the inversion and over as one. Now, admittedly, that's stopping all the momentum. That's good. Helps you learn. One, second part as one. Cut, invert, and over as one. Now, eventually you want to get all three. But all the mechanics and everything else stay the same throughout all of that. So to recap, work from the core. Stay reasonably square. Try not to tilt. When you do this, if you feel the need to turn your legs for comfort, please do so, or stability, please do so. Start with just the low cuts with your arms, and add an inversion on either side at your point of discomfort. And then after an inversion, go over the head, trying to keep all your arms straight when you do it. And then the flow is 4 cuts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? I know that wasn't all perfect. I know there were some slip-ups. Do your best to ignore them. And I'll see you all in part 2.